Good evening. Good evening. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We are so happy to be hosting you all for our new law, new era for affordable housing webinar, where we will walk you through what to expect from PA 251. My name is Jennifer Coy Hudson. I am the advocacy director at Open Communities Alliance. I will be your host and moderator for tonight's conversation. And I am so pleased to be joined by a few housing experts all across the Northeast who will talk to us a little bit about certainly the new law and how it interacts with some of the current laws that we have here. Um, I think right now, what I want to say is that we are in a time of uh, societal challenge where many of us have been feeling hopeless about our sort of prospects for the future. And I think many of us were perplexed or excited. There was a lot of sort of complicated feelings around the housing bill, but I think overall, what we know is that there needed to be some shakeup and there needed to be some change around how we are tackling affordable housing in Connecticut. Folks are struggling and people are looking for the what do we do next? What do we have the opportunity to do? What do we have the opportunity to change? And so the passage of this bill, I think, is a really great opportunity for us to go into our communities and start to shake some things up and make sure that people are getting access to their basic needs. So with that, again, we are so happy that you are here and you are joining us for this conversation. I'm going to give you all a little bit of an overview of what we'll be doing tonight. So first we'll hear from Hugh Bailey. He's the policy director at Open Communities Alliance. He will give us a rundown of Public Act 25-1. Then we will hear from John Guszkowski, a planner and a member of the state's Council of Housing Development. We will then hear from Liz Torres. She is the founder of HousingSmarts. And Mia Sachs, she is the president of Princeton, New Jersey's City Council. For our panelists, I just want to remind you that when you come onto the screen, please turn on your video. No one will see you until you turn on your video. And when you are done presenting, please turn off your video so that the next speaker can join us. Uh, if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature. We will be collecting those questions and we will be welcoming all of the panelists at the end of the call on to video to help answer some of your questions that are coming from your municipalities and COGs. With that, I will welcome Hugh, who will walk us through PA 251.
Thank you so much, Jen. Really appreciate the introduction, and thank you to everybody for taking the time to be here. As Jen mentioned, this is, a really important time for housing in Connecticut. It's been a really long struggle to get something passed, but as we all know, getting something passed is just the beginning. The implementation is going to be so important. So even as we look to helping people who have immediate needs and making sure that people's needs are taken care of in the short term, we also really want to be focused on implementation of this bill, because what this is going to do is provide a framework finally for building, allowing the construction of the affordable housing that Connecticut so desperately needs. We've seen really across the political spectrum agreement that there is a problem in housing, there is a shortage, there is a need, and now we finally have a framework where the state will guide a process where towns will make decisions on their own. They'll still be deciding for themselves what it will look like, but there will be a process that will guide them. And PA 25-1, which is the public act that was passed last year, At the end of last year, after some difficulties, we had a bill that was passed in the regular session, and then it was vetoed, and then there was a lot of uncertainty. But then we did finally get a bill passed in the special session, and it's already being enacted. There are already committees that have been formed and that are working to get this law into actual practice. It's going to be a long run. We'll run through all the steps. You'll see that it will take literal years before we see, shovels in the ground on some of these things, which is part of the nature of the business, but it is a long process and there's a lot to it. So we can dive right in. I am going to share my screen here. And one of the things we'll be talking a lot about is all of the different steps in the housing growth plans. This is PA 25-1, an analysis of the housing growth plans. Now, PA 25-1 has all kinds of different aspects to it. It has aspects that concern the conversion of commercial properties into residential, which is very important. It has aspects about transit-oriented development, hugely important. It changes parking requirements, huge changes. Bans hostile architecture. We'll get into all kinds of different things of that, but we're really going to focus today on the housing growth plan analysis because it really provides a framework for affordable housing to be built in every single community around the state. So starting very quickly, by March 1st, OPM is the Office of Policy and Management. They are going to produce guidance, and this guidance is really going to shape the process. DOH is the State Department of Housing, and the COGS are these councils of governments, which are very important to the process, as we'll see. They're being consulted. They have been consulted. They are being consulted as we speak. This guidance that OPM is producing will specify formats, standards, and measures for annual reporting. So all towns will be measured on how they are going about implementing their plans once those plans are in place. These guidelines we really consider to be key. The timeline is incredibly short. The bill was signed in December, and this guidance is supposed to be due in March. OPM has been clear that this will be an ongoing process. These guidelines will be updated. What comes out on March 1st is not the end by any means, but it is an important milestone. And to our friends at OPM, if any of you are on here, we certainly understand the pressure that you're under, and we know that this is a lot of work in a very short amount of time, and we know that there's a lot on your plate. No one underestimates the difficulties of this, but it's very important. The measures will include things like permits issued for housing, certificates of occupancy, and deed restricted units by income. This is really going to be an important part of the ongoing process, this guidance that will sort of shape the whole process. So that's the first deadline that's coming up. The next thing that's coming up is in July, the state OPM GIS office, Geographic Information Systems, is going to develop tools to compile an inventory of developable land. Developable land is basically anything in the state where you could build something, where you could build housing. That does not mean just empty lots. It doesn't mean just wooded areas where there's nothing. It also includes developed land because land can be redeveloped. We look at it as if there's a piece of land that could feasibly be turned into, 5,000 square foot McMansions, then it could also be used for affordable housing. So this is going to be a really important milestone as well. We really need to keep a close eye on this developable land because it really sort of gives a guideline for what can be used for the purposes of affordable housing. Now, certainly some land cannot be. If it is wetlands, if it's the side of a cliff, things like that, if there's topography, if there are all kinds of other considerations that cannot be used, that needs to be taken into consideration. Most other land that's not set aside for a public purpose or open space and conservation, or if it can't be developed for some legal restriction, most other land should fall under the category of developable land. So that's something we'll be keeping a close eye on. OPM will establish a regional housing need program. This will look at all the different areas of the state and develop housing growth targets. This is not just affordable housing, this is housing. So they're going to be looking at what housing is needed in all parts of the state. They're going to be looking at a number of different targets, a number of different factors going into this. This has been done a few times for people who've been following the process. There have been a number of different studies that have looked at what housing is needed around the state. So OPM has said that they will be, relying in, some fashion on some of those studies that have been done as recently as just a year or two ago. But they're going to have important factors going into this, including cost burden, what you see at the bottom, that last bullet there. That's the number of households that are at 30% of median income and are paying more than half of their income towards housing. That's really a proxy that is used not only by OCA, but by a lot of fair housing organizations for, if you have that number, that's a good indicator of what the need is for affordable housing. So that's one of the factors that's going to be used. That's due by December 1st. So again, a lot happening just this year. So the next step is going to be the COGs. These are councils of governments, which are organizations of the municipalities. They're not governmental bodies. They're collections of governments. The councils of governments will develop these needs assessments, and these will be establishing affordable housing goals, not just housing, affordable housing goals. And there's a required methodology. You have to consider the Zoning Enabling Act and Federal Fair Housing Act obligations. And I'll talk about that in a minute. That's really important because it really helps guide the process. Some of the other factors, if your town has greater ability, greater per capita income, then your number might be a little higher. It's important to note that fourth note there, no town will grow by greater than 20% of occupied households. It's not like a town is going to turn into a city, or a small rural area is going to become unrecognizable. This is measured growth. This is within targets that are reasonable. So it's not going to change the face of any of our towns. I think that's something important to keep in mind. As much as we need a lot of new housing, we understand that towns have their own specific characteristics, and that's not going to change dramatically as this goes along. So then the COG will seek OPM approval of those regional housing needs assessments and their municipal goals that were just discussed. They have to go back up to the state to get that approval. And OPM will either approve or reject those goals. Now, there are some municipalities that are exempt from this process. These are the 20 lowest per capita municipalities. You can see them in a list over there. That doesn't mean that these municipalities, which is most of the largest cities in the state, it doesn't mean that they don't need housing. It doesn't mean they don't need investment. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be spending state dollars there. It doesn't mean any of that at all. What it does mean is that they have been asked to date to host most of the affordable housing in the state, and they have the fewest resources with which to do so. So the new law is not asking them to do more of what they have already been doing. It does ask them to look at their housing needs and make plans for things including rehabilitation of existing housing, and look at other factors for what their cities need, but it doesn't ask them to deal with a affordable housing allocation like the other towns do. I understand there's a lot of steps here. This is not how anybody would have designed it if we were starting from scratch, but it is what we got after our long and serious process. So the next thing that happens is there are two options. Either municipality opts for a regional growth plan or a municipal growth plan. Regional means they use their COG. Municipal means they go it alone and they do their own plan. If the municipality accepts the COG unit allocation, they create their regional growth plan. The COG submits it to OPM. OPM approves it, and there is money to be had. The bill makes clear that there are monetary rewards for plans that are approved and that follow all of the guidelines. And if the municipalities decide to go for their own municipal growth plan, they don't take part in the regional one, they do their own plan. They can also be eligible for those dollars if other requirements are met. There's a lot of steps to get there. I think in a lot of ways, the state is hoping that a lot of the towns go with the COG plan because we are looking for regionalization. But if the municipalities decide to go on their own, they can also get some of those rewards. This is just a summary of some of those rewards. Importantly, there's a 5% school construction boost for towns that are approved and that go through the process. That can add up to a lot of money. School construction costs are a serious, that's a lot of money involved. So a 5% bonus there would mean a lot. And the Housing Growth Program awards. This is about infrastructure. There's a lot of talk about infrastructure. That is a serious concern. And it's something that, towns really take seriously. There is going to be money available for infrastructure to help the construction of this housing. So that's on the table as well. So all of that, a lot to take in. I know there's a lot of steps and it's very hard to keep it straight. There is a lot of promise in this process. If all towns went into this in good faith and were trying to make the best of it, I think we could all agree that this could really lead to some great outcomes. However, there are some key missing elements that, we are a little concerned about. There are not provisions for families with multiple bedrooms. So families with children are at risk of being left out under the current scenario. Rental housing, it doesn't necessarily call for rental housing, and it doesn't call for housing affordable at lower income levels. So these are things that originally we would have liked to have seen in the law, and as it continues to be implemented, we would like to see part of it, but as of now, they're not part of it. Having said that, the process as it is implemented, as the law is implemented, there are other laws that play into this, and they will all be central to the implementation. All of the bodies that OPM, the councils of government, and the municipalities have a duty to affirmatively further fair housing, right? That's part of the law. PA 25-1 requires conformity with the Zoning Enabling Act. The Zoning Enabling Act has fair housing obligations. So as towns are going through this process, they have to abide by fair housing laws. Connecticut's Constitution has an anti-segregation provision. That needs to be abided by. Connecticut has other state fair housing laws. So all of these play into the process. Even if they're not explicitly laid out in this law, they do play into other laws. So they're all going to have to work together. This is just a list of some of the protected classes that are relevant in this case. Familial status. You can't discriminate against families with children. So in the process of coming up with a housing plan, it's clear that families with children will need to be accounted for. Lawful source of income is a protected class, so you can't discriminate against people who, for instance, have a housing voucher. Age, marital status, veteran status, all of these are protected classes. So what this means in real life is the interplay between our fair housing laws as they exist and this new law. We have data that shows that Black and Latino households earn half or less of white households in the state and have, in terms of wealth, about 1/10 or less. That's the reality that we have in this state. 58% of Black households are renters compared to only 24% of white households. And families with children, as mentioned, and people with disabilities are protected under fair housing laws. So at each point in this process, whether it's at the state level, the COGs, the municipalities, they must factor in equity as they decide on these plans. Planning has to envision housing at different income levels. That's just the law. It needs to include rental units, and units with 2+ bedrooms need to be included because of what we said about families with children. You can't discriminate against based on familial status. So there's a lot going on here. We're most interested, obviously, in seeing housing built, and we want to see the fair housing aspect. Want to see how that plays in, because that is going to be so important to making sure that the bill is implemented fairly and with equity and builds the housing that we all recognize that we need and does it in a way that works for the state of Connecticut. I understand that was a lot of information, but with that, I'm going to pass it on to John Guszkowski, who is not only recognized for his planning in the state with Tyche Planning, does great work in so many different municipalities around the state, but is an integral part of this process, this implementation process. And I'll let John take it from there. Thank you.
Hi, Hugh. Thank you. And hey, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully people will be able. Jen, can you enable screen sharing, or whoever is in charge of that? I was going to put up my PowerPoint.
Yes. And you would think in the days after COVID, we have nailed this down. And, alas, there we are.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so and I'm going to hopefully start this properly so it looks like a presentation. All right, you guys seeing the presentation?
You got it, John.
Okay, great. All right. So as Hugh said, I'm a planner with Tyche Planning Policy Group. And I have been involved in several discussions over the last several years about affordable housing plans, about planning and zoning laws in Connecticut, in my role as co-chair in the government relations committee at CCAPA, which is the Connecticut chapter of the American Planning Association, which is a professional organization of the local, regional, state planners in Connecticut. And more recently, I have been appointed by Speaker of the House Matt Ritter to co-chair the newly created Council on Housing Development that was created by Public Act 25-1. But much of the presentation I'm going to do today is actually based on some prior work that we had done with the Open Communities Alliance and Talk, which is a citizens-led organization in the town of Glastonbury that is advocating for broader fair housing. So back in 2022, this is when all municipalities were sort of scrambling to finish their first mandated affordable housing plans that were required by Section 830J of the Connecticut General Statutes. And OCA and Talk, the Glastonbury groups, wanted to see what a fair share plan would look like for the community of Glastonbury. And OCA, as many of you know, have been advocating for fair share planning in Connecticut, similar to the model that was developed in New Jersey many years ago now. And in many ways, this act, Public Act 25-1, is a partial realization of that advocacy and a real credit to OCA and the advocates for bringing in basically numbers, actual targeted numbers of new housing units to the discussion in Connecticut. And so sort of as part of that overall exploration process, we were asked to work with Glastonbury as an example and basically say, what would a fair share plan look like? What would it entail? And in many ways, we think that this could be a model for what housing growth plans under Public Act 25-1 might look like. So I'm just going to briefly go through our broad approach in Glastonbury, and to kind of get people sort of thinking, get their thinking juices going about what housing growth plans could look like. So in Glastonbury, and again, the housing growth plans ultimately will arrive on a number. The state OPM is going to come up with a big number of needed housing units, and they're going to divide that into 9 chunks for the 9 cogs. And then each cog is going to have to divide that, medium-sized number up into, somewhere between 6 and 38, individual municipal numbers based on the number of municipalities in their cog region. So for the fair share plan purposes, the number that we were targeting in Glastonbury is 1,550, which, initially seems like a pretty big number. But, remember, Glastonbury is a fair sized town. It's over 30,000 people. So they've got, between 10 and 15,000 housing units already. So this is, under that 20% threshold of change that Hugh had mentioned. And it's also worth pointing out that in part of our research, we talked to the Glastonbury Housing Authority, which manages a bunch of affordable housing units in town, and they noted that they have a current waiting list of over 1,000 people, 1,000 current residents of Glastonbury who are looking for more affordable housing. So calling it 1,500 units is actually not crazy, and it is actually borne out by the actual conditions on the ground. So a couple of things that we are assumptions in developing this fair share plan. And again, this is not a true policy plan. It was basically a tabletop exercise for how we could come up with that number of 1,500. Couple of the assumptions is, Glastonbury is a hot market in terms of real estate, in terms of people looking to move and live in Glastonbury or stay in Glastonbury. So we assumed the market demand would be there. So if these 1,500 units were produced, people would buy them, rent them, live in them. We didn't assume that the entire town, Glastonbury is a very big town geographically, and only the tiny percentage of it, maybe less than 10% of the geographic area of Glastonbury, is actually on sewer and water lines. So we assumed that there could be some extension of sewer and water infrastructure, but not, not far. It would basically be modest expansions, not throughout the entire municipality. We made sure that we understood that there is no single, the town was not going to build, a 125-story building and put all the units there. There's no silver bullet. There's not a single construction. But this is going to have to, we're going to have to eat an elephant in a whole bunch of different bites, a combination of actions. And some of these things would not directly impact the fair share number, but they were very important regulatory and policy changes that would need to happen in order to move Glastonbury down that line towards that. And we along the way, we had a great deal of support from the town of Glastonbury GIS department to really help with our analysis. So in brief, we broke down our fair share allocation into basically 6 key recommendations, which is implementing inclusionary zoning as a fundamental requirement. Inclusionary zoning, which is Connecticut General Statutes 8-2I, basically allows municipalities to require, as a percentage of any new housing development, a percentage of those new units would have to be restricted as affordable. So this is enabling legislation that is already in place that's somewhat akin to subdivision regulations. If you're familiar with that, if you subdivide in most places in Connecticut, you may be required to set aside open space as part of the development. In this case, in a similar way, if you are going to develop 10 houses, the town could, through its zoning, require you to set aside 1 or 2 or 3 of those as restricted affordable. And so, the first recommendation is to basically, if any new building in Glastonbury would have some percentage that has to be by law, by regulation, restricted as affordable. There were other zoning changes that are critical to enable that fair share units, including different ways to increase density and increase developable land, and we'll go through some of those. To make sure that the town is part of the solution, the town itself is part of the solution, we had a couple of recommendations. One is that the town has land. Most towns have some surplus land that are not already allocated to, it's the town hall, or that's a school, or that's our park, or that's our Little League field, or our fire station. Municipalities have excess land, sometimes through tax sales, sometimes through being deeded it by someone who has passed away. But towns usually have pieces of land that are unspoken for. So the town would use those unrestricted lands to promote affordable housing, as well as actually putting some money on the table to actually, municipal bond funds, municipal budgetary funds to assist with the development, whether it be housing authority, whether it be public-private partnerships, but the town would have to put some skin in the game. Other things, converting underused retail and office facilities. This, we developed this in 2022, coming out of COVID, where office work took a huge dive with more and more people working at home or having flexible work schedules. The need for big offices, and Glastonbury in particular is a huge suburban office park community, and they have a lot of empty buildings, and so allowing those buildings to be filled up instead of with offices that people aren't looking for anymore, converted to housing. And then there's a couple of other investment strategies. So we'll go through these briefly, and I'll not belabor them, because again, each of these is part of the puzzle, one bite at the elephant, essentially. And we also tried to make some assumptions, as you'll see as I go through the slides, what some of those numbers might be to help us get towards that number of 1,550. Okay, so I explained inclusionary zoning, that you basically require a certain number, and you could do that either through just a straight up 10%, 15%, 20% of the new development has to be restricted. You could do that just as a requirement. You could do it as a density bonus. So basically, your subdivision or your zoning regulations tell you, okay, on this parcel we could get 10 units, but if we're willing to set aside 2 or 3 or 4, you can get 15 units. And so there'd be density bonuses to try to incentivize the market. Or in some cases, if it didn't make economic sense to restrict the properties on site in any particular development, to contribute to a trust fund similar to you would pay into an open space fund when the town can buy open space somewhere else. The town could buy affordability, develop affordable units somewhere else. The next recommendation were some of the changes that would be made in order to sort of plump up the number of available housing units that could be then included in the inclusionary requirements. And what you'll note is a lot of the stuff that we recommended back in 2022 were actually became part of this new law when it actually hit the ground, Public Act 25-1. One of the first of those is missing middle housing. And so these are basically 2 through 9 units, duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, little townhouse, things like that, to basically allow those as of right. So instead of just single family residential zoning on any residential lot, even if you don't have public water or public sewer, you could get a reasonably sized septic system that could serve 4 units, 5 units, 6 units, and allow those as of right. And perhaps have some design considerations that you can make sure that it sort of still looks like a larger single family residence. But you're basically, doubling, tripling, quadrupling the potential capacity for residential development on all lots in town, all developable lots in town. And so we made a couple of assumptions that there could be, that there were by GIS, we determined that there were over 500 vacant residential properties in Glastonbury without public water or public sewer. So developable lots, over 500 of them. We assumed a very small percentage of them that would develop. Only 0.3% would develop, and each of those would create 5. And at a 25% affordable, you got almost 200 units there. So assuming a very small percentage of those developable lots took advantage of the fact that they, instead of just a single family lot, they could build a 5-plex on that and restrict, a small percentage of those, you can still come out with 200 units. It's quite a lot. And then conversion of existing lots. So you say you have a single family residence on an existing lot. You want to expand. You want to turn that single family into a 2-family, a 3-family, a 4-family by adding on. There's lots of those, over 10,000 lots in Glastonbury that qualify, that have already been built on. We assume a very small percentage, less, a quarter of 1%, experience some would take advantage of this. And again, with a percentage of redevelopment being affordable, you could come up with over 300 lots. So, with these relatively small changes and very small percentages of people taking advantage of them, the numbers start to add up. Another one of the regulatory changes would be allowing more moderate density multifamily to basically expand Glastonbury's allowance for multifamily in areas with public sewer and water. So even if previously you had been in a single family residential zone, if you had sewer and water, we would propose to allow multifamily. And so we did the math on that, that there were 175 lots that were within close proximity or currently on public sewer and water. And we assumed, again, 0.5% would take advantage of that and develop those lots as multifamily. Again, because they have sewer and water, densities are able to be a little bit higher. And so we assumed 14 units per on average. And again, a required percentage, a quarter of those would be required to be affordable. Another 300 units on the books. And then similar to the previous step, if you had an existing house that's served by sewer and water, and you're all of a sudden allowed to expand and allowed to turn your single family lot into a multifamily lot, there's a good number of those, 4,500 lots that are single family residences on sewer and water. We assumed 0.1% would take advantage of that. Actually, 1/100 of 1%, 1/100 of 1%, creating again multifamily units. You get another 150 affordable units based on that math. Again, we've tried to be relatively conservative about our assumptions here. And then one of the big ones, and this is in many communities, would be the tough pill to swallow, which is basically getting rid of the 1.5 acre, 2 acre, 3 acre arbitrary zoning minimums on our rural or suburban residential lots, because frankly they're fairly arbitrary. If your soils are reasonable, if you're not on top of a rock ledge or in a swamp, most soils are suitable for an efficient septic system. And so move from that arbitrary 2-acre minimum and down to a soil base. So if you can get a septic system on a property, you can have a smaller lot. And so this requires a little bit more science and a little bit more math. But then it would basically allow people to chop up there. So if you have an existing 1.5 acres, 2 acres, and you've got one house on it, to basically allow people to cut those in half, cut them in thirds, and to do very small scale subdivisions or micro splits. And basically, instead of requiring that additional unit that is created to be restricted, we would charge a fee and put that into a trust fund. And so, based on that, if we assumed 1,000 people, which is again a very small percentage, or I'm sorry, 1,000 of the 1,000 lots, we assume a very small percentage would take advantage of this and pay a $5,000 fee to enable them to basically have a whole brand new building lot, a $5,000 fee. All of a sudden, you've got $500,000 in your trust fund. And again, these are very small percentages, and then the town has some money that it can contribute towards a development project. And the other thing, we would increase maximum lot coverages. In Glastonbury, the town had a 10 or 15% lot coverage, which is a fairly small coverage area, very rural density in terms of your lot coverage, a lot of green space, a lot of undeveloped. And we'd increase that because, again, particularly much of Glastonbury, in the northwest portion of Glastonbury, it's fairly built up. It's fairly highly developed, and you can definitely support higher densities with higher lot coverages. A couple of the other regulatory changes, Glastonbury did have on their books, they had something called a planned area development, which is basically a special development district with some allowance for multifamily and some increased density. We would propose in this case to streamline that and make it a little bit more aggressive, and that basically looking at larger properties. Again, this was a GIS exercise within 500 feet of sewer and water areas. So basically within reasonable sewer expansion areas, and looking at properties that were sort of surrounded by development, but themselves hadn't been developed yet. And so we saw a couple of these. 155 Addison Road here is an example. You see there's development all around it, but it has been relatively undeveloped itself. It's an old farm field. But it's right approximate to sewer lines. So we looked at basically 20 of these parcels that are higher capacity when they're multiple acres. These are larger than 10-acre parcels. And if we could get 20 of them and assume an average of 24 additional units with a 25% affordability, some of these higher capacity parcels could add significant numbers. Our conservative number was another 120 affordable units. But again, these lots are big. You could get a lot of properties on them, particularly given the fact of sewer and water. And then the other element that we looked at was properties owned by the town. So we looked at town-owned acreage, again, targeting sewer and water or close to sewer and water with 5 or more acres. And so we're flagging a couple of examples here of town-owned properties. The yellow is the outline of the property. The one on the left, Keeney Street and Hebron Ave, is 32 acres. The smaller one on Western is only 5 acres. Both of them are on sewer and water areas, so could be developed significantly. The Hebron Avenue one, we looked at either doing 200 units at 12 units to the acre or apartments of 400 units, which is 20 units to the acre. Neither of those are what we would call high density. Those are probably moderate suburban density multifamily. And so sort of in keeping with what Glastonbury has already established in terms of its multifamily. And then on Western Boulevard, 5 acres, 100 residential units seems reasonable. And so the town would go through that exercise. And then we looked at the town actually putting money on the table, either through direct investment to the Glastonbury Housing Authority, which has been very successful in developing properties and making them available, or creating a brand new public-private partnership or municipal housing development entity, like a community development corporation, and basically fund them. And Glastonbury's, nobody likes to see their taxes go up, but if you bond for some of these funds, it's amortized over many years at a reasonable rate, and the town puts $25 million on the table. over a 10-year period, we assume that you could see at least 100 or 150 units with that investment. So the town is actually contributing. And then some of the last recommendations were converting underutilized retail, as I said before. We basically looked at LoopNet and some commercial real estate brokerages at the time of basically empty retail. And there were several at the time in 2022, where you've got these, I believe the property on the left, which is I think in the Western Boulevard area, you've got 45 or 50,000 square feet there that was basically almost entirely underutilized. The building's already in place, the parking lot's already in place, sewer and water's already in place. Obviously expense retrofitting, adding a lot more bedrooms and showers and things like that. But that kind of modification would definitely spur private developers, private investments. And we would look at, converting a few of these, just 3 to 5 of these buildings could create another 100 or 150 units of affordable. And then a few other potential options that we looked at for the town is looking at buying down of existing existing rental costs. So existing apartments that are market rate, and so therefore not necessarily affordable, because again, Glastonbury is a slightly higher end market, to basically work with landlords and say, listen, if your market rate is $2,000 a year or $2,000 a month, and affordable rate is $1,400 a month, let's make a deal. We'll buy down that difference, and you make this unit affordable. And the developer the landlord is basically made whole, and the town gets more affordable units for its investment, and we estimated that to be approximately a $10 million pot. And again, that doesn't solve the problem on its own. It is a part of the solution. And then some of the other recommendations included allowing a second unit or accessory units with some affordable restrictions. And again, affordable accessory apartments are generally allowable in most communities these days, thanks to Public Act 2129, if I'm remembering that correctly. And if you restricted just 10% of those apartments as affordable, you could put another 50 or 60 units on the table. And so this is sort of the last slide of this stuff. And so you see, piece by piece, element by element, different, regulatory changes, different requirements, different restrictions, you are able to get to that number. And at the end of the day, we came up with that number of 1550. And again, this is an exercise that doesn't require the town to do anything yet other than chart a path forward towards a specific number. And that's precisely what the housing growth plans are asking municipalities to do. It's not asking towns to build anything yet. It's not asking towns to put down money on the table yet. It's just, here's your number. How can we theoretically get there? And let's make a plan. And that is exactly what we developed in Glastonbury, and we hope can be roughly a model for municipalities and regions going forward with our housing growth plans. So I'll stop there with that, but I did want to mention just a couple of quick things that Hugh maybe glossed on that is worth. These are some of the deep cuts in Public Act 25.1. Again, this is a 90+ page document with 50 something sections. There were a couple of other changes that are worth highlighting that I just want to mention very quickly. These are those. I'll go through them. Fair rent commissions was something that was only a few municipalities were required to have by virtue of their size. This law brought down that cap to 15,000 people population and required that for fair rent commissions. So either a standalone fair rent commission or participation in a regional fair rent commission. So the darker numbers, I believe the blue, the lighter blue numbers, the lighter blue were the municipalities that were currently required to have a fair rent commission. And following the passage of this new law, all of the ones in green have to come up with either a standalone or a regional fair rent commission. So a lot more focus in a lot of our suburban communities on fair rent. This law also changed protest petitions. Previously, if you were an abutter to a property that was looking to get its zoning changed. Let's say in Glastonbury, there was a property that wanted to become a planned residential development district, so rezoned. There was a protest petition provision in the statutes that would allow somewhere between 20 and 50%, or require 20% of the abutting property owners to the applicant property could sign a petition that basically said, we object to this proposed change. And if that petition was properly developed and filed, it would change the Planning and Zoning Commission's burden of passage from a simple majority to a 2/3 majority. So it essentially created a veto by neighbors that would have to be overridden by the Planning and Zoning Commission if they wanted to pass the zoning change. This new law, for the most part, eliminates that. It ups the percentage of abutting property owners from 20% to 50%. So now basically half or more of the neighbors would have to object. However, if they object and file this petition, it does not really change the vote. It lowers the threshold for an approval vote from the 2/3 to a simple majority. In other words, the standards are the same for a Planning and Zoning Commission. Either you vote it up or you vote it down, and the protest petition actually doesn't change the vote at all. So this is kind of a nail in the coffin of the sort of organized NIMBY response to some zoning changes. Mobile homes were also given a little bit more consideration and are essentially required by zoning to be treated identically to single-family residences, single-family or multifamily residences. So if you allow a single-family residence on a property or multifamily residence on a property, you have to accept that that house or those series of houses could be essentially mobile homes or mobile manufactured homes. And it basically eliminates the municipality's ability to discriminate based on, the origin or provenance of the type of housing. A little bit more equality there. And then finally, I think, as Hugh mentioned, there's a ban on hostile architecture that basically would prevent municipalities from, putting out park benches or seating or other, community landscape, hardscape things that would prevent people or actively prevent people from essentially sleeping on them or spending a lot of time on them. And basically saying you can no longer, essentially criminalize, being unhoused. So I think that's a positive. Okay, so that's quite a lot. This is who I am, and I am grateful to have the opportunity to speak with you folks. And I will turn it over to Liz. Is that right?
Yes. Good evening, everyone. Nice to be with you all this evening. I'm also going to share my screen here. Make sure this works, and I think, yeah, we're off. So my name is Liz Torres. I am a real estate development consultant. I founded HousingSmarts about 6, maybe 7 years ago. I've spent my entire career in the affordable housing and nonprofit space, and am working with nonprofits and municipalities across the state of Connecticut to either build new housing or preserve existing housing. So Erin asked me to share some examples of projects that I've either am working on or have had a role in developing in recent years. And so thrilled to share these projects with you this evening. So affordable housing comes in all shapes and sizes, and I'm going to share 3 examples recently constructed in Connecticut and or planned here in the state. Before I do, I just wanted to share some common themes among all of these projects. One is location. All the 3 projects that I'm going to share with you are located in high and moderate opportunity areas. Yes, they're located in towns where there's this perception of NIMBYism. However, the developers working on these projects were able to navigate those politics and have success in working with the towns. All of the projects are located in near amenities. That means either on a commercial corridor or near one, access to transportation and or other amenities like a grocery stores nearby, restaurants, cafes, and things like that. Each of the projects are being done in partnership. So there's a local, maybe smaller, up and coming, developer, and or a social service provider, and a larger, more experienced nonprofit housing development company. Um, each of the projects had challenges regarding public utilities. In the case of Hebron, it did not have access to water or sewer. In the case of the project in Madison, it only had access to public water. In the case of the project in Hamden, it actually has public utilities. All of the projects either have obtained their approvals for zoning through 8-30G or intend to. All of the projects needed a ton of public subsidy from the state of Connecticut and the Housing Finance Agency. All of them needed tax agreements from the town as well. All right. So the first is Wellington at Madison. Wellington at Madison is a beautiful mixed income affordable housing development that was recently completed, actually less than a year ago. The development, as you can see here, is like a condominium style where the buildings are clustered throughout the site. There's a nice walking path. It's beautifully landscaped. This development also included the preservation of a historic structure, and it also included a community building as well. This 31 unit development cost $13 million to develop and use the low-income housing tax credit program to fund the majority of the cost. The next project is a project that is underway and making some real great progress on the development front. It's a project located in Hebron, Connecticut. It's called Church Street Commons. It's located right next door to St. Peter's Church. It's located in the Hebron's town center and also will include the preservation of a historic building, but it also includes the new construction of some townhomes as well as an apartment block at the rear of the building. And this development in the end will create 50 new housing units and will provide housing for a range of household sizes and incomes as well. This project is expected to cost $24 million and will rely on the low-income housing tax credit program and state subsidies. And then the last project, which is a project located in Hamden, Connecticut. It's a partnership between Monitor My Health and Elderly Housing Management, also known as the New Samaritan. This client is proposing to actually adapt the existing building and add an addition to the building in the back. So it was really important that, at least to the client, that the experience of either the person driving by or walking by wouldn't change because of the housing that was being built, that it would remain, the design would remain the same. And so this project in the end will include a 4,000 square foot community hub for Monitor My Health's headquarters and 19 senior housing units in the back. And we do not expect this project to leverage tax credits, but we will rely heavily on state and other subsidy to support the project. And with that, I'll end my presentation and look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And Finally, for the conversation, I'm gonna welcome Councilwoman Mia on camera, and she will talk about the implementation of a similar policy in New Jersey. Hi, Mia.
Hi, so I just want to make sure my understanding was this was ending at 7:30 and it's 7:29. So do I have a little bit more than a minute? Mm.
Absolutely, you do. You can take your full time. Yes.
Okay, well I'll try to be as quick as possible because I know you want to get questions in. So first of all, congratulations to all of you on your bill. I know how much work it takes to get something like this passed. It's really exciting. I can totally relate to the stress of being under the tight timeframes because we are uh, coming down the final stretch of our housing plan in my town and in all the towns in New Jersey. We have a March 15th deadline to submit the final implementing ordinances. So it's stressful, but a real you have a real sense of satisfaction when you're finished. So there are so many parallels between New Jersey and well, affluent towns like mine, Princeton, many affluent towns in Connecticut. We are uh, the poster child for a town in which everyone has a sign that says "All are welcome," and that's true if you can afford the price point. So I am just starting my third term in office, and my uh, overarching objective in being in office was to expand affordable housing in my town. And fortunately, New Jersey has arguably one of the strongest frameworks for the creation of affordable housing in the country. It's called the Mount Laurel process, and it is a constitutional doctrine which requires municipalities to use zoning power in a way that provides each municipality with uh, a number, and that is their fair share of the region's need for affordable housing. And it also prohibits exclusionary zoning. It has been in place since 1975. We are just going into the fourth round. It's sort of a hybrid between there is court enforcement, but for many years there was an agency called COA, the Council on Affordable Housing, which oversaw implementation of towns' plans. That became, unfortunately, ineffective because it was too politicized. And so the process went back to the courts. And then in 2024, the state passed new legislation, which I was very involved in advocating for, which is a 4S50, which is a new state framework built on the Mount Laurel system. But it's less court, it's less rigid and less there's less court enforcement and more room for towns to really to have autonomy and agency to do what they want to do. So anyway, to cut to the chase, when I got into office, my town had signed its third round housing settlement after a 40-day court trial in which it fought its obligation, and through a variety of things that I was very involved in overseeing the implementation of my town's third round obligation, which led to more than 1,000 units of new housing being constructed in a few short years, the bulk of which were in a few blocks around my house. So no one can say that in Princeton that their elected officials don't know what are imposing on their constituents something different than what they want for their own neighborhoods. So the third round was very instructive for me in that I realized how uh, disadvantageous it is for elected officials to wait until the last minute and try to then comply. I realize, it seems that your system is more incentive based, more carrots than sticks. But I think the one thing that I've learned is that planning is essential. And if you have to plan at the last minute, you end up with less than optimal results. So, having worked very hard to implement the third round plan in a short amount of time, because of what happened in the state, I was then very involved with creating my town's fourth round plan, which I like to think of as I feel as proud of it as I do my children. And it was a lot of work, and it was built on the notion that each of us as municipalities have to do our part to respond to the twin crises, the climate crisis and the housing crisis. And so our fourth round plan is entirely built in a smart growth model. We have 14 sites, and all of them are walkable, bikeable in the center of town. And as I like to say, not a single blade of grass will be destroyed in the creation of these 14 sites in our fourth round plan. Um, we have also done a lot of missing middle. We overhauled our master plan and paved the way for upzoning. We created New Jersey's first ADU ordinance, which is actually one of the most, if not the most radical in the country, because it allows for separate sale of the units. So all of these different modalities and ways at increasing housing at different price points have been what I've been focused on and in my town. And I think during this period, we have in Princeton both created more affordable housing and preserved more environmentally sensitive open space than really in the probably the preceding half century in Princeton. So the two are not mutually exclusive. We are also one of the country's most historic towns, and the bulk of our housing sites are being built in or near very sensitive historic districts. So all of these things that people throw out as barriers or opposition to affordable housing, I feel like we've overcome those challenges in Princeton and been able to successfully create affordable housing that's affordable and statutorily compliant affordable housing. Uh, and I think the final thing I just want to say is that the most important, local officials are the gatekeepers for zoning and housing. And so if local officials cannot be inspired by a vision and have the courage to rise to the challenge, none of this is going to happen. And that's why why I agree to be part of panels like this, because I had no background in this. I didn't even know before I was in office what a developer was. My background is in social justice and nonprofit. So it was drinking from a fire hose, but I'm really proud of what we've done. And I just hope to inspire other local officials to reach the challenge and to understand that this is an opportunity, to think of it as an opportunity rather than an obligation, and to think of it as a way to enhance sustainability through smart growth. And I could get into all sorts of things we've done with redevelopment and negotiating um, uh, all sorts of community amenities and additional stormwater mitigation programs, bike and pedestrian infrastructure. These are all things, improvements that we've negotiated with our development partners. Sustainable transportation. We have a sustainable transportation fund. But anyway, I am open to answering questions for anyone who feels, particularly local officials who feel overwhelmed by this, or by anyone who wants to persuade their local representatives that this is the right thing to do. I'm happy to speak to any of that. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Mia. Y'all, it's late, and we want to get some of your questions answered. So I'm going to invite all of our panelists onto the screen, Hugh, John, Elizabeth, Mia, and we also have with us Aaron Boggs, who is the executive director at Open Communities Alliance, and has been doing this work for a very, very long time. I know everyone is excited to answer some questions. So if you have a burning question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen to submit your questions. I think we'll probably have time to answer a handful. Let's just see. And whoever feels so moved can unmute and answer the questions as I pose them. So the first one, how will these new builds affect property taxes to existing homeowners?
My sense is it's kind of impossible to tell yet. I mean, broadly speaking, and it really depends. You know, if residential development can be a mixed bag in terms of property taxes. Multifamily, which tends to generate fewer kids, is usually a net revenue positive for communities. Um, you know, a moderate size, you know, McMansions or smaller are tend to be net revenue negative. Um, you know, more people sometimes mean more services, but they also bring in, you know, more businesses because you increase your demands for shopping and services and things like that. I I think it's impossible to say, but growth is growth. More people mean more business, and more business means more revenue. So, you know, broadly speaking, it's a blend, but I don't think there's any, you know, magical answer.
Good, Mia.
So I can't predict what's going to happen in Connecticut, but as I said, I think there are a lot of similarities, and um, there are certain drivers of increases, as we know as local officials, for tax increases, such as pensions, benefits, healthcare cost. We have found in Princeton that right now we would be facing significant tax increases were it not for our inclusionary family sites from our third round that have become among the most commercially uh, productive sites in our town. They are generating a tremendous amount of revenue, even though they have a 20% affordable set aside. And that it's really keeping us afloat right now. And we, uh, converted a number of stranded assets and did mixed use. So those were underutilized office park shopping centers that were on the verge of bankruptcy. And yes, even in affluent towns like mine, there are stranded assets. And those sites have now been brought back to life and are generating a tremendous amount of tax revenue. So I mean, for anyone who is concerned about property values or tax increases, that is really, a misunderstanding and a red herring. It is from an economic development perspective, this sort of growth is very beneficial for a town. And I
Great.
see that across the board, not just in my town. So.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Mia and John. I'll go on to the next one. We've gotten concerns here that building so many residential units will create costs to towns for schools, sewers, traffic. How do we address these concerns? And I'll just add my little two sentences. This is what we hear all of the time when we go from town to town and we are in forums. This is the main thing that is bubbling up. What do you say to folks who are concerned?
Yeah, I I would agree that that's those are the main concerns that we hear. I would say that there's a lot of different answers to that. One is that nearly every school system in the state of Connecticut is seeing declining enrollment, um, to the point that you're seeing a lot of schools close, especially in the rural areas of Connecticut. There aren't enough kids to keep schools open. And what that means is that if you're, in a far-flung town and your school closes, that means instead of a 20-minute bus ride, your kid has to go on a 35-minute bus ride. So it's that there are consequences in the other direction too. So um, depending on the kind of housing, you can get more school kids, but not necessarily. A lot of the housing that is built in Connecticut, the multifamily housing, doesn't tend to bring in a lot of kids. That's not the kind of housing that we necessarily want to see, because we want to see housing that supports families. We want to see housing that families with children can move into. So there are multiple sides to that. We've also seen, in Trumbull went through a sort of a mini binge of building apartments, and they did a big study, and they looked back and they said, well, they actually ended up making money off of it. The cost of the services, the cost of, the additional infrastructure, the cost of the additional, everything that went with it, was more than made up for by the extra revenue that was brought in. So that's part of it as well. And in terms of traffic, traffic is something that is unavoidable in a place like Connecticut. I'm sure New Jersey is the same. But we've also found that when you do these sorts of things alongside good planning, you can make things better in your town. And Glastonbury is a good example because we saw, many units added to the central area of Glastonbury. And at the same time, they improved their traffic flow. They put in roundabouts. They put in, some new amenities that actually made things better. So they added a lot of people. They added a lot of units to the area, and traffic got better. So I think we have to not assume that development means congestion. It could be an opportunity for better planning, and it could actually make things a little better.
I just wanted to add to that with the traffic equation. So in the center of our town, we have Princeton University. We have almost 30,000 people who commute into Princeton and out every day. It's a huge amount of traffic. To the extent that we can create housing near to the region's largest employer in our region, we are cutting down on traffic, and I think that's the case for a lot of towns. I also want to say, with school kids, um, who wants to be a town that's trying to keep out families? I mean, who wants to be a town with no children? What a depressing thought. Um, and yes, children do cost money, but there are fixed costs, and it really only starts to add up if, like my town, you are at the moment where your school facilities are already expanded, but we've been very creative. We've purchased a new property for our schools. We've done pilot sharing. There are lots of creative things you can do. And it basically goes back to what kind of town do you want to be? Do you want to be a town full of, you know, s- uh, you know, just one age group? Do you want to be all seniors, or do you want to have families at every age and price point? That's a vibrant town.
Mia, thank you so much for that. And I think myself and Kirk on the outreach and advocacy team at Open Community Alliance are always coming up against this particular question. And that's actually probably the first time that I've heard that particular answer. Who wants to live in a town without children? What kind of bleak future are we trying to build? I think that that's a really compelling argument. We have a few more questions here, and then I think we will call it a night. Um, Here's one. I am struck by the examples that incorporate historic buildings, none of which come with any protections. We'd like to do that. Are there specific arguments we can use, programs or income sources that we can tap, or any other incentives? If the person who asked that question could give me a little more detail in the chat, unless you all feel like you have enough detail to answer that question.
Well, there are federally and state available historic preservation tax credits for restoration of historic properties that if you stack them all together can be as much as 40% of redevelopment costs. Those tend to be competitive, and they do tend to come with strings attached. So renovations and additions, particularly on the envelope of the building, need to be historic in character, and so sometimes that can add cost. Like you're replacing windows, you can't just replace like a beautiful old leaded window with like a vinyl window sash. So there are increased costs because of historic preservation, but there are historic preservation tax credit programs available, both again through the state and federal governments.
Great. Others? It's good. And I actually think this is a good question to end it off. Connie asks, is there an advantage or disadvantage to a town going it alone versus joining a cog? Will small towns feel overrun by the larger towns?
I have theories. The big advantage of going with a region is it's free. The regions are given money. Each region is given by the state, by this program, $200,000 each cog each year, specifically to help produce these plans. If you go it alone in your municipality, you're going to pay for it yourself if you're hiring a consultant or some housing expert. So you're out of pocket. I think, you know, there's a lot more small towns than there are big towns. And in COGS, you know, most COGS structures, the small towns get the same vote as the big towns, the big cities. So, you know, I would encourage municipalities to have an active seat at their COG table. And you know, this is going to be going on for the next year. So if you know, don't like the direction things are going, you've got time to choose. But municipalities should advocate for themselves and be active parts of the process with the COG who is getting paid to do this.
Others, Aaron, Hugh, good. Okay, with that, I am deeply appreciative of any time that I get to share space with housing experts. I learn so much. I've been at Open Communities Alliance for a year, and I am still learning about the intricacies of building affordable housing. So I do appreciate you all. I do have a few sort of announcement-y kind of things. You know, this is a critical moment for folks to get their hands dirty, for folks to lean in and start to make sure that we are doing this work well. So if you would like to have us come to your town and talk to your town administrators to walk them through some of the intricacies of this plan, we would love to come to your town. Abby will put my email in the chat. You can reach out directly to me directly to me, and we will coordinate that with you all. If you are part of a COG, we'd love to come and speak to your COG as well. If you are interested in fair housing, Open Communities Alliance runs a fair housing testing program. We would love to have folks who are residents come and participate in our fair housing testing program. We will actually share details of what fair housing testing is in the follow-up email after this event. And finally, if you want us to come and talk to your church groups, your religious circles, uh, uh, host a meal in your community center or whatever space that you hold with your neighbors to make this information accessible and tangible for you and a group of folks in your town. We would love to do that. So again, you can reach directly out to me. Of course, Aaron and Hugh on the call as well will share their emails with you, and we would love to coordinate some time to be with you directly in your community. With that, we thank you all so much, our presenters. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. For our viewers, thank you so much for being with us tonight, late on this Wednesday. We have work to do and we'll get it done. Take care.